happy to be in Ghent again after a few years. Let me start first by saying a few words about Marx. Now, after the crisis of the Wall Street system that exploded in 2008, there was a return on a sort of semi-superficial level, but for some people also seriously, to reading Marx. Why? It wasn't that suddenly people were deciding to become Marxists, but in order to understand the system that had relapsed into a crisis once again, they had to return to a philosopher whose life's work had been to understand the laws of motion of capital. And even the hardcore supporters of the system, economist supporters, went back and reread just to understand their own system. And that was a tribute to the old philosopher.
Even Alan Greenspan was confused. The former head of the Federal Reserve and one of the radical defenders of unbound financial markets had to confess in October 2008 that his worldview did no longer work. Quote, "Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity are in a state of shocked disbelief. What went wrong with global economies that had worked so efficiently for nearly 4 decades?" Unquote. Even if Greenspan's disbelief is surprising, given the recurring disasters on global financial markets since 1987, his perplexity is shared by most of the economic opinion makers. Every new crash, it seems, represents a new situation. It lies outside of all expectations, yields fatal consequences, forces a search for explanations, for reasons and rationality. Apparently, this is the result, in Alan Greenspan's famous phrase, of irrational exuberance that challenges the system of economic rationality itself. Economics, the theology of our times, provides 2 different interpretations for the actual troubles in the financial markets.
There's not many difference between center-left and center-right. There's not really a big idea coming from the left, but maybe you have an idea. What should happen?
Well, this is it's not an easy question to answer, because as individuals, we have many ideas. And I agreed, I want to just say this, I didn't find myself in any disagreement at all with what Joseph said. I mean, it's a wonderful analysis of the financial system. The problem arises when you have to come up with ideas, because we know what has failed. And we have to ask ourselves why it failed. And I think that system which we knew as state socialism in Eastern Europe, Russia, China, Vietnam, wherever you want it failed, in my opinion, for 2 reasons. It failed because it totally excluded any intervention from non-state forces. Both economically, I think it was a big, big mistake, and this is debated, by the way, by economists or socialist economists, that the complete takeover by the state of everything was a disaster. That whereas the commanding heights of the economy, it can be justified, should be under state control, to nationalize everything under the sun, including family restaurants, is just as irrational as what the other irrationalities we've been discussing. That was one big problem. Secondly, to combine with that a political structure in which you only have one party. is a disaster, because it means you have no mediations at all via which the popular will can be reflected or represented. And that's a disaster. And I've been arguing that the popular will is not being represented today, and that we know that, but it's a huge problem. But any form of socialism, I think, that exists has to be much, much more democratic than anything we have known before in socialist or capitalist societies today. That is an essential criteria.
Are you then pleading for the social democratic capitalism about which you spoke?
Well, I'm not. I'm pleading, if you like, for, to call it social democratic doesn't make any sense because of what's happened to social democracy. But I am pleading for a form of socialism in which the commanding heights are controlled by the state, but there is a lot of freedom for small enterprises, and for ultra-democracy. The two go hand in hand, and I think that is an alternative which people would probably like today.
What do you mean with ultra-democracy?
I mean not just ritual elections once every 4 years or 5 years which produce a ritual government, but, for instance, going back to some of the ideas which arose in the 19th century in France and in Britain, the whole huge Chartist movement that developed to fight for democratic rights, they had, one of their demands was annual parliaments to keep politicians on their toes. And another demand which emerged from the Paris Commune in France was the right of people to recall a member of parliament or whatever when they felt that this member of parliament was no longer carrying out their... What that means is for the people to remain engaged in politics, which is the exact opposite of today, where the system, as we see it, more or less institutionalizes apathy. Consumerism is fine. Go and shop, borrow money, shop, pornography. I mean, I'm not a moral person in that sense, but institutionalized pornography is fine. Anything you want, but don't be engaged. And that cycle, I think, has to be broken. And if it is not broken by progressive people and people on the left, the alternatives are dangerous. Sarkozy is expelling the Romas. In Naples, angry right-wingers are burning Romas. There's a huge wave of Islamophobia in Europe today. And right-wing parties have gained 20 members of parliament in Sweden. So, unless an alternative emerges, the right will benefit.